Welcome, everyone. This is a screening of a wonderful film, a documentary entitled DNA Dreams by Bregtje van der Haak. And we're happy to have her with us. And also a really, I think, interesting panel of respondents to the film. Arthur Kleinman, who's director of the Harvard University Asia Center and professor of anthropology and medical anthropology at Harvard, and many, many other things. Peter Galison, who's Pellegrino University professor of the history of science and director of the collection of historical scientific instruments. And George Church, Robert Winthrop Professor of Genetics, Harvard Medical School. I'm Evelynn Hammonds. I'm director of the project on race and gender in science and medicine at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research, as well as the Barbara Gutman Rosencrantz Professor of the History of Science, and also Professor of African and African American Studies. Everybody on this panel has too many titles. In any event, I just want to say a little bit about why we're showing this screening this evening. Over the summer, I brought together a number of historians of science, sociologists of science, legal scholars who work on genetics and society, and geneticists together to have a talk about the kinds of issues that are coming up across the social sciences with respect to the new research on genomics. And many of the people there said it would be interesting for us to talk about this particular film. And Bregtje's film had just come out at that point in time. Many of the people in the room had seen it. Others had not. But it almost derailed our entire workshop because people couldn't stop talking about the issues that were raised by the film. So we thought this would be a wonderful film to bring to the campus, larger campus, and invite other folks to come in and see this and have a conversation about some of the themes and issues that are raised by the film. So thank you all for being here. I know it is deadly trying to get around the yard in Cambridge and everything with the snow, so I really appreciate your presence. And for the students who made it here, you do get extra credit for traipsing through all of this. The students looked up as I said that. But I really hope that we can have a good conversation. We're small enough so that many people can express their opinions about the film. And it's wonderful to have Bregtje here who just flew in today. So we're happy that she was able to be here. And I look forward to the conversation that we have afterwards. So please, Mr. Technical people, let's go. Thank you all for being here. So we have the filmmaker, we have George, Arthur, and Peter, who will be our commentators about the film. I thought we might start before we let people in the audience talk, to have Bregtje just say a little bit about why'd you do this film? What got you into this whole story? And our technical people will do things to help at some point give us light, I hope. Go ahead. Yes.
Okay, so I heard about BGI. I read about it actually in the South China Morning Post when I was living in Hong Kong for a while and teaching documentary filmmaking there. And I was already kind of intrigued by the fact that my students in Hong Kong were so really in love with technology without any of the inhibitions that we have in Europe. And when I read about the ambitions of Shenzhen to become this center, this hub globally of life sciences and informatics, I thought it was very, very interesting. So I was kind of following this kind of news. But then I read at the very end of one of these articles that they were going to do this high-profile study about the genetic location of intelligence. And the project was going to be headed by an 18-year-old boy. And then I thought, well, this is really strange. This is maybe a film. So then I contacted them, and they were very open, very welcoming. And I met Bowen. And actually, Hai Hong is also here, our collaborator in Shenzhen. He was already working with them. And so we were allowed to follow the project. They were just starting up at the time. And it got more and more interesting.
Great, thank you. So let me ask you to just say a little bit more about how you gained access to inside of BGI, and then we'll ask some other questions about the film.
Yes, I get asked the question a lot about access, but it wasn't very difficult. And I mean, I didn't try to force my way in or anything like that. I just wrote them an email. I said, I'm very interested in your cognitive genomics project, especially because it's headed by Bowen, as 18-year-old. And they said, oh, please come over, we'll show you. And then we were basically, I mean, given permission to do whatever we wanted. But then, I mean, there were lots of things that we missed. But it wasn't, I think, because they were trying to hide them from us or we weren't allowed. It was just a very difficult situation to really get a grasp on, because there are 4,000 people working there, and the bioinformaticians, their average age is 24, and they're in all kinds of different buildings, but the main building is a former shoe factory, so they're on different floors, and I don't speak Chinese. We worked, of course, with a translator, but it was like 3 times cultural gap, because it was, of course, the Chinese culture, but it was also the culture of science, and then within science, it's very specific culture of automated genetic science and the sequencer. So there were a lot of things to manage and try to understand while we were filming it already.
Great, thank you. So first, I'd like to ask Peter your responses.
I thought it was a very interesting film, and I thought about it in terms of a crossing of 3 disastrous trends from the 20th century that have come together in one remarkable moment that you've captured so vividly. One is a sort of single parameter picture of intelligence, which has a 150-year-old, not very laudable tradition behind it. It's constantly been redefined, and the narcissistic pleasure that many of the actors seem to derive from their self-congratulation as themselves exemplars of high IQ intelligence was one I thought was actually very funny and revealing. You know, the relationship between their picture of themselves and what they thought they were doing, and how the world would be so much better if people were more like them. The second was a genetic determinism, that somehow if you could get the code right, if you could sequence right, that it was a data mining project and nothing more. And not just a reductionism to genetics, but a reductionism to pure code, when we know that there's so much more than that in the relationship between genetics, the transmission of information, and eventually its arrival at the actual being that it produces. And then the third is this picture of people as the sort of the commodification of people, that we can manipulate them, select, change them, go in and kind of alter them. And I think, the European experience over the last century tells us how badly that goes awry. And, in a way, I think the history of treating people as material objects on genetic grounds and so on, and racial grounds, is behind a lot of the strength of the European reaction, or the differential strength between American and European attitudes towards GMO, genetically modified organisms. And I thought that was strongly presented in the film, and good. As I say, probably resonates. That third theme probably is more instantly recognizable in a continental European tradition than in the American tradition, although the first two would resonate very strongly here. So I thought that as a kind of film exploration of what happens when genetic determinism, single parameter intelligence, and the objectification and the materialization of human beings by racial or other categories was really beautifully and remarkably shown in a kind of, I love the sort of the naive self-presentation of the cognitive geneticists and the sort of the delighted narcissism, like some kind of Blakean innocence that pervades the film. So thank you for making it.
So, Arthur, what do you think?
Well, rather than rehearse the things, repeat the things that Peter said, let me act as the China scholar here.
Yes, that's what your job is.
And say that, to begin with, when you hear, let me also have a disclaimer that I know Yang Wanming, and he's been several times at our Asia Vision 21 conference, and he allowed one of our PhD students, Sung Wenqing, to do an ethnography of BGI, which will be published, I think, next year. You hear him say, "I have a dream." The allusion is not to Martin Luther King. It's to Xi Jinping, who spoke very, very specifically of 中国梦, of the Chinese dream, of China's dream, that this is China's moment on the stage, that this is when the Chinese will stand up. This is when the Chinese dream, not the American dream or the European dream, will become the dominant dream. And I think you, knowing Dr. Yang, I can tell you that I think there's a real resonance with that in his own approach. The second thing you should know is that this, in theory, BGI is not a governmental organization. But in the same way that NGOs in China are called gongos, that is, governmentally organized non-governmental organizations, the BGI has a shuji, a party secretary. It has a party branch. Everyone has a dangan, a party folio, a transcript in which you're audited and your life history and your predilections are taken into account. So really, it's inseparable from the political domain of things. Next thing is that the Chinese have their own history of racism. And Frank Dakota, who's been a visitor at the Fairbanks Center several times, has written a brilliant book on racism in Chinese society, which goes way back and distinguished between different kinds of people in terms of skin color as well as other features. So it's important to recognize that there's that Chinese aspect of things. The next thing is the relationship of sort of the academic enterprise and the business enterprise. When BGI was created, it was created as a scientific research institute with a clearly academic enterprise in mind. But increasingly, the business enterprise has loomed large, and that's in keeping with Chinese society. Just think about where they off-branched things. It's not Beijing to Xi'an. It's Beijing to Shenzhen. Now, Shenzhen in Guangdong province, which is just across the border from Hong Kong and from the new territories of Hong Kong, was 40 years ago a village of 40,000. Today it's a city of how many? 9 million? Maybe 11?
More than that.
Maybe 11 or so, yeah. That's an extraordinary development in 40 years. And it's an intriguing city by Chinese standards because it's in a province that has the most distinguishedly different dialect probably of all Chinese dialects, Guangdong province and Cantonese speakers, but it is a Mandarin-speaking city because it's a city of immigrants, and it's a city in which many things can happen. The development of fortunes very quickly, like the Wang Ke Corporation and Mr. Wang Shi, who spent 2 years with us here at Harvard, and is a friend. I assume I know he knows Yang Wangming because they've been at some of our conferences together, but probably he has real contacts with him in Shenzhen. And it's important to realize the scale of business that this fits in. So just take the Wang Ke Corporation. That single corporation owns 2.5% of all residential real estate in China. Now, 2.5% doesn't sound like a lot, but we're talking about all of China, okay? Shenzhen is also the home of Mr. Wang Wunyan's integrated copper company, the largest integrated copper company in China and one of the largest in the world. And Mr. Wang is the 19th wealthiest man in China. Shenzhen is filled with immense enterprises and the like. And this enterprise is a huge enterprise. At its origin, BGI derived itself, really, if you think about it, from its collaboration. It was the only non-Western collaborator with the Human Genome Project at NIH. Today, I don't know, Professor Church will tell us, but it's probably 5 times or greater the size of the Genomic Project at NIH in terms of sheer scale. It's a big increase of that. And so behind this movie, if you read it from a Chinese standpoint, is the story of China in the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century. It's a story of it's a huge nationalistic story of a country that once was the Central Kingdom, that went through a period of tremendous decline under colonial pressures, and that has now revivified itself in our era. And I was just thinking as I listened to this, how similar it was to the story I heard from a Chinese admiral who we had visit the Asia Center at Harvard, and we put on a panel with a Japanese admiral and a Indian admiral. And the Chinese admiral was provoked by the Japanese admiral and the Indian admiral. And finally he said angrily, "We're going to build a fleet of aircraft carriers that will, by 2050, be at the same level as the American fleet of aircraft carriers." And the Japanese admiral responded, "Gee, that's wonderful." And the Chinese admiral was shocked and looked at him twice. And the Japanese admiral, "Because it'll break the bank in China," said the Japanese admiral. By the way, as an aside, the Indian admiral said, by the way, when China was talking about the projection of power through aircraft carriers, he said there's a reason, the Indian admiral said, that it's called the Indian Ocean. So I think the degree of nationalism in this, tied up with the genetics, can't be underestimated. Right. This is, the story of China in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, is China's shame, is the feeling of humiliation of the Central Kingdom. And the story of China today is not dissimilar to the situation of Japan vis-a-vis the United States in the 1970s, right, when it looked like Japan would overcome the United States in terms of its economic might. So those are the contexts that I would put it in. Within, there are some other things that are really lovely. I mean, the whole picture is very interesting. You could teach this entirely from a Chinese perspective. Think of the young psychologist who's going to go to Brown and her relationship to her parents. I did a book with my former students, all of whom are now well-known professors in China, called Deep China: What's Happened to the Moral Life of the Chinese. And one of the things we described, and it's been described in many ethnographies and by journalists and many others, is the weakening of filial bonds. But the weakening of filial bonds is a weakening from below. It's filiality no longer do the parents seen by the children have the same kind of status they had when those of you who are Chinese in the audience would know when the Shaojing was written, the classic of filial piety, where the parents had all the status. Now, for the kids, horizontal relationships have replaced verticality, but not for the parents. And you saw it in this. And actually, I have several students now who are studying love in the Chinese context. This feeling of what happens from the perspective of the parents. You saw that feeling of educated parents speaking to a daughter who they don't want to leave. They don't want her to leave, right, et cetera. So there are many other features in this. I would just say it's a marvelous portrayal, and I think it's the last point I'd make is what I really liked it was the way that you cut away from the labs to the scenes of ordinary life. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was what gave the tension. Mm-hmm. Its impetus to affect us and make us think mm-hmm. about things, to realize that that China's going through a vast project of urbanization. Right. You showed those monstrous urban structures. China was up until 1978 was 70% rural. Today it's more urban than rural.
So let's have George have a word in. Yeah. George, the science. Yeah. The film sort of gives us a little bit of a sense of, as Arthur just said, sort of a road to dominance in a particular way. What's your view of this?
Well, so a number of very provocative things have been brought up already, and my disclosure is I have been an advisor to BGI for 8 years, and a company they just acquired called CGI, an American company, for the same 8 years, and they merged very recently. So I would say that in addition to nationalism, they actually have a pretty strong strain of internationalism that I find quite refreshing, and I thought it was reflected in the movie a little bit. You saw that a lot of the people that were Westerners in that movie were there for a meeting, an annual meeting. And I knew many of the people there. It was refreshing. So I think the science was well represented. I don't think it was distorted. I think they were being quite frank. I mean, you can poke fun at it if, it is funny, but it is the way they talk. I mean, that wasn't hokey in front of the camera speech. I know these people, and that's the way they talk. Hopefully, I'm not going to talk that way tonight, but the science is advancing very quickly. It's advancing much faster than Moore's law for electronics, which is already alarmingly fast. And so if you combine that with the exponential in the growth of Shenzhen as the exemplar of China, and I've seen it firsthand a few times over the years, and it's something to think about, certainly to reflect on as to what it all means. I think that we can reassure ourselves with thoughts about how it's much more complicated than this one-dimensional way of thinking about things, and it's not deterministic like these idiots think it is, and so on. But it's not always. Science sometimes is easier than it looks rather than harder. I'm not saying that I'm not predicting in this particular case, but for example, height is not intelligence, but height is very complicated. It's probably the biggest study, much bigger than this study that was done on almost 400,000 people has been done, and found 9,500 genetic variants, explain 29% of the trait variants. But on the other hand, and so you could say, well, that's what they're going to find with intelligence, at best, is 9,500 variations that are spread throughout the population, making this whole bell curve. But on the other hand, with height, occasionally you'll find that person that's 1 in a million or 1 in 100 million who's 8'5", and you could figure out exactly why that happened. And it trumps the 9,500 SNPs that explain the variance for the bell curve, because that person has a pituitary tumor or has, you know, high levels of growth hormone for some reason. And the same thing happens at the other end of the spectrum. So sometimes it is deterministic and it is simple. So to just say that they won't find anything is false reassurance. And if they do find something, they'll take the next step. And I think that was what was beautiful about the pig part of the movie. And full disclosure, I just do pig genetics. But you know, they are manipulating pigs, and they are like babies, and it's amazing what you can do, and they will be in practice. So one last framing comment, which is people, I mean, we, ethicists, get distracted by things like human cloning and you know, eugenics and the European history, and for that matter, American history in eugenics. Let's not blame it on the Europeans. But the thing is, this is not a nationalistic thing that we learned from eugenics. This is now parents making decisions. It changes the decision, it changes the argument. And we're not commoditizing genetics, and we don't have to do it on babies or embryos. We can do it on adults. And I think the whole commoditization argument has to be at least considered for a moment as to what if we can do this on adults? What if we can do it on ourselves? Is that commoditization? You know, or is that fundamentally different from taking pharmaceuticals and, you know, getting an education at Harvard and other things that we do to ourselves and to our children?
Okay, I'm not going to make any comments on these responses. I'm going to open it up because I see a lot of people who have questions, and I know they have interesting questions. So let me start. I'm going to go this way. Yes. You want to stand at the mic?
There's a mic right behind you.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing film, and I appreciate all of your comments. They were incredible. My question really has to do with when considering tampering with people's IQ. The question at the back of my mind was really, how do we define IQ, and what are we losing by limiting that definition? Like, what do we call intelligence? And if we could create something that would help people figure out and problem solve better, like the way that they were doing in the test, what does that give us? What does that limit? How does that limit us? And so I think, yeah, I would like to really, if we can, unpack what they're really looking at. Like, height is one thing, but when you talk about IQ, what are you looking at? Thank you.
So, Bregtje, what do you think that can you expand a little bit about what you know the people in the film were thinking about in terms of IQ? Because you use the word IQ as if we all understand and we're all talking about the same thing. We may not be talking about the same thing.
Yeah, this was from the very beginning. This was like everyday recurring discussion with my crew because they were so shocked. Like they talk about IQ. What the hell is IQ? You know, what does it mean to be smart? And I mean, there is this test. I mean, there are many tests, but the one that is used a lot. They just studied it a little bit, and they took the test that is used most widely, the WISC. And well, I was just kind of shocked or maybe made uncomfortable by what you mentioned, that there are these people that are scientists and they are intelligent by standards of this kind of tests. And at the same time, the way they are operating, I couldn't help but feel that there's a large part of their intelligence that hadn't been developed somehow, not properly maybe, or not fully. and they didn't see that. So I thought that was very disturbing in a way. But I mean, at some point, I mean, I had many discussions during the research and preparation for the filming also about this test and how should I approach it and how do we see it. And basically, I think what these tests results show is how good you are at doing these tests. I mean, that's what they measure. And I think there is. I think if the film shows one thing, it's maybe that you need more different kinds of intelligence to bring about something useful or valuable, and that's maybe also why I leave in all these scenes about life, because I think I'm not. Didn't try to make a kind of pamphlet or a manifesto against this happening. I think it's like you say, it's very international, it's very global. It's not that Chinese are scary or so incredibly different that it happens there. I think scientists want to do these things, and so they do it. And we are left to deal with the results. And I think culture matters, and culture is how you eat, where you live, how you love, how you date, how you meet, how you relate to each other. And in that sense, I think I wanted to put the two together in the film. And I think the same goes for intelligence, that is maybe a little bit larger than what these tests can measure.
Well, the one thing we'll be sure of, they won't measure political intelligence.
Yes. Yeah.
Doesn't work. Oh, it's working? Okay, great. Hi there. My name's Susan Greenhall. I'm a colleague of Arthur's in the anthropology department. I work on China. I also work on Chinese science. So I was very interested in the film. And I just wanted to deepen our understanding of the cultural context in which these kinds of developments are playing out. There's several aspects that haven't been brought out yet that I think are really important when we think about how this sort of culture is very pervasive in China. First thing is there's this notion of suzhou, or quality. I actually watched this film with a certain amount of fear, a trepidation and caution. And what I'm hearing is a certain amount of a celebratory reception, and maybe I'm mishearing. But one thing is there's a notion of suzhou, which means human essence. It means quality, technically. It's very pervasive in Chinese culture. And for many years, the one-child policy was promoting quality. And originally, it meant like intelligence and physical quality. And here now, quality is being biologized, and that's being essentialized.
But so, Susan, you're saying that this sort of, you're expanding on the notion that IQ, our IQ, is not their IQ.
You could say that. I'm just saying there is this wider cultural notion of quality in which their attitudes toward IQ are embedded.
Right.
That's just one small point. Second point is I was really taken by one comment that the young woman made, which is, this is great to do in China because there's no government regulation. So the second point is, it's true that a lot of science in China is done with this sort of Wild West approach where you've got corporations investing in scientists, and there's this wider notion in China that there are a lot of issues of scientific integrity and scientific quality. I have no idea the extent to which it applies to the work of the BGI, but there's that going on in China. The third thing is I was interested in Peter's comments about the apparently naive sort of belief in science and genomics. And the thing is, this exists in an incredibly scientistic culture in which modern science and technology are considered kinds of religions. And it's sort of where things were in this country maybe 50 years ago, pre-World War II for sure. But there's no critical voice in China about what are the limits of science, what are the limits of high technology. So all these issues are very apt to be raised at this particular time.
Actually, but I think about, for example, I mean, Haak could say better, but genetically manipulated foods. There is a lot of discussion about that in China. I mean, it's not that everything technological or manipulated genetically is accepted very easily. It's very controversial, right? There are talk show debates about that. And
I think Susan's points are very, very good points. The suzhou, especially the quality, the idea of that people in rural areas are not of the same quality as urbanites, already embeds many of the problems that Peter pointed to and that I would second. Yeah.
It's very essential, and it justifies rampant discrimination and exclusion.
Absolutely.
Categories of people, and now that's being biologized.
Yes.
First, I think that I want to say from outside the world, maybe the role of BGI is its ability to sequence the genes in a very efficient way. Yeah, and in China, and BGI has another meaning. It's about social reform, and because BGI is not a gongo. Yeah, BGI is an institute established by independent scientists and some investors. Yeah, and in China, how the difference between gongo and an NGO, there is only one core standard. It's gongo. The directors of the gongo are appointed by the Communist Party, by the government. And its business, its plan are controlled by the government, or should get the permission from the government. But BGI, all the directors are appointed by its board. So it's an independent institute. Yeah. So you know.
Does the Shuji
I will explain. I will explain that. Yeah, and you know, in China, if you want to have some normal relations with the outside world, with the other different departments, you must have a Suji inside in your organization. Yeah, because you need him to participate in some meeting for you. But the difference is that if the Suji can decide the appointment of the directors or can decide the plans of this organization, it's a difference. Yeah, even in China, Wanke, for example, it's not a state-owned company, but it must have a Suji to connect with other Sujis. Yeah, so I think that in China, most people think that BGI is, before BGI, all the scientific research organizations were owned and controlled by the government. But BGI, no. Yeah, and I think so. I should give this explanation. And also, the founders of BGI, they don't like the bureaucracy. So they fled from the government-owned organization to establish their own organization. They use their own money to begin the career. So it's one thing. Another is that I think that about the moral problem of gene technology. Yeah, I have talked this with the founder of BGI, Wang Jian. He has an answer. I think that I should share to you. Yeah, and he said that even these technology are not controversial to the Christian values. Yeah, because God is creator. Yeah. God creates everything, and God gives breath to human being, to give you life. So you are an image of God. So you have this potentiality of creation in your nature. Yeah. So what you do is follow God. So thank you.
Thank you. That's a lot for us to think about. Janet.
Janet Brown from the History of Science Department. I found this a completely absorbing and enthralling film, so I'm very glad to have seen it. Thank you. And I wanted to ask a little more of a kind of magazine question, like the critical responses to this movie, where you're going to distribute it and whether it will be an internationally distributed film, and what kind of responses you're likely to anticipate. For example, here we're thrilled to have seen it, and we feel it's a little dangerous and interesting and engaging, but it may well be in other places you would get a different response. And I'm just wondering whether you have shown it in China, for example, or whether you're going to show it in India. Arthur gave us this amazing anecdote of the Indian admiral. Where are you going to show, and what are you going to anticipate?
It has been shown quite widely through TV broadcasting sales distribution. I haven't been personally present at a screening in China, but you have. And of course, we send it to BGI. We didn't have an actual, face-to-face screening with them, but they were happy with it, I think. And maybe you can say, well, how was the reception in the screening you organized in China?
Actually, I would like to hear, yes.
Yeah. We screened the movie for several universities, and it's kind of the people get excited as well. And but the movie does.
Introduce yourself before you continue, so people know a little bit.
My name is Hong Hai, and go back.
Yeah, you go maybe on the mic. Hong Hai collaborated with us in Shenzhen because we were following the IQ project over about a year and a half time, and we had sometimes something happened on one day and we couldn't go, and we made a co-production with Hai Hong's office in Shenzhen, so he would go film sometimes when we weren't there. For example, the dating show, I wasn't there, he did it.
I'm good at that. Thank you. So I'm the founder of TimeDoc. So it's the co-producer of the movie. We screened the movie for several times already in some universities in China, like Zhejiang and Beijing universities, all around some. Every time when we show the movie, the students always be excited. But actually, the movie does generate some kind of the controversy. It's kind of the moral issues and kind of the like what's the future for the talented people, and what kind of the deals we will made if we figure out like the difference of the gene performance. So we do have some kind of the debate with this kind of the issues. That's the situation in China. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And it was shown in Doha at the Al Jazeera Film Festival just 2 months ago, and there it was also very intensely discussed. And I think that maybe we did manage to make a film that isn't just confirming when you are already worried about these developments, and isn't just also great when you're a scientist. I try to produce and direct something that makes you think about these things and make up your own mind, basically.
Jennifer.
I want to join the list of people thanking both you, but also the panel as a whole. Is really an interesting session. And thank you, Evelynn. I'm curious about the last couple of minutes about the move to Denmark. So this is partly, I think, maybe a question to George about kind of the international links among these, very high-end genomics enterprises, obviously including the Broad, but not specifically. So kind of how is this happening among scientists, I guess, is one version. But also the question about kind of the politics. I mean, the conventional wisdom that we've been sort of assuming is that the European politics around genomics feels very different from the Chinese politics and maybe from the American politics. So what's going on? I mean, was this highly controversial in Denmark? Is this just a statement that sort of the science this revolution is encompassed, et cetera, et cetera. So what's going on? How do we understand both scientifically and politically the last sort of 2 minutes of the show?
We're right. So BGI started as a small investment of NIH so that there would be something more than just Western sequencing. They contributed 1% to the first human genome, so it was a fairly small contribution. I would say at this point they're almost equal to the rest of the world put together. The Danish collaboration is one of their closest and goes very far back, and on many different topics, including human genetics. And so they had kind of a series of papers that paved the way to opening up BGI in Europe or in Denmark, or whatever you want to call it. They also opened up BGI Americas. In part, in that one, it was more emphasis on service. That is to say, they would take in other people's sequencing for profit. But I think they have a number of collaborators from around the world, these international conferences. It's the same sort of people that are regularly coming back that are collaborating with them and discussing. So I think there was no surprise. I don't think there was any pushback in Denmark, but I'm not, as far as I know, you know.
Okay, one last question.
Thank you so much. That was an excellent film. I got taken away by the comment made by the Danish scientists about the people who have approached his organization wanting to be cloned, and the fact that they have requested to be cloned showed to be fools, so that they disqualify themselves in the process. But taking back to a movie that I saw a few years back, and that was The Kids from Brazil, if I remember correctly. And the question behind that was Hitler wanted to be cloned, whatever, someone took some Hitler cells, whatever, to be cloned.
Boys from Brazil.
The boys from Brazil,
yes.
okay, the boys from Brazil. You say that you are an ethicist, and is there an organization internationally that somehow gets some guidelines out there about what can be done or not?
There are international agreements. It varies quite a bit from country to country. There is a, quote, ban on cloning that has many exceptions and exemptions in different countries. I think it's a minority of states in the United States who have a ban on such things. But I think that the problem with a lot of this is they're fighting yesterday's battles, or imaginary battles that happened in yesterday. Cloning is not that useful, and it's not that threatening. What could dramatically change our interaction with our genetics. It's the same sort of thing that's dramatically changed our interaction with our world already. It's been mostly mechanical and pharmaceutical so far that's made us unrecognizable to our ancestors, driving fast cars and performance-enhancing drugs and so forth. But doing it on adults, I think, is, but doing it meaning gene therapy. That we mentioned, it comes up occasionally that people are worried about GMO crops, but for the most part, this does not translate to genetically modified pharmaceuticals or genetic engineering, which is approved in Europe, officially approved in Europe before it was approved in the United States.
May I add one thing? Because there was one thing that was suggested to me several times during the production process, but I couldn't get it confirmed on camera, is that the party leadership's DNA is also kept by BGI in the freezers. Is that right? You heard that too, huh? Yes. So in case we need to replicate them, we have the materials.
So, because I'm a historian of science, and I'm going to give Peter the last penultimate word on some of this. I mean, I do this because I think what I've heard is it's incredibly fascinating. I find this film extraordinarily fascinating. I hope many of us will use it in our teaching because I think it raises some very serious issues we ought to be talking about. And one of my concerns is about public engagement with these kinds of technologies. How will people know how to enter into this conversation? Right? How will people begin to understand the kinds of things that George is saying, which speaks to a kind of, sort of a set of technical issues, but it doesn't speak to what it means for our whole society. So I think that our society is not the only one engaged in all of these. So I think I actually got very excited, and I felt like, oh my God, history of science, we're going to be the ones who understand all this stuff. But you can laugh at that if you want. But what I'm saying is, I think it opens a space for a kind of public engagement with science that I think is something that our field is particularly suited to put out there and be in front of. So that's why I wanted to give you the other word.
Well, I think there are two aspects of this. One is what history can tell us, and the other is that film is a particularly good way of putting an opening to a wider discussion. It's a kind of forum, one of the few forums we have for common discussion these days, since we don't share a consensus about papers of record or other forms of an agora that existed in the long history of democracy and other governmental forms. I think that what history can do, for instance, in the IQ discussion is, it matters, for instance, that there was a certain moment where it was decided that men and women should normatively have the same IQ, and they throw questions out that don't give you a similar response from men and women on IQ tests because it was considered to be absurd and unacceptable for all sorts of reasons to have the case that it wasn't so. Now, that was a decision. That wasn't a piece of, that didn't drop from heaven like the crystalline structure of this particular element. It was a decision that took place. And the long history of what I'm calling single parameter intelligence measures, has changed radically as to what's considered to be intelligence. And even within the narrowest of fields, if you say, not just, eliminate dance and sports and art and theater and all the emotional intelligence, eliminate all that, just take the sciences, eliminate biology and chemistry, just take physics, eliminate the difference of intelligence between making an experiment, designing an instrument, and doing a theory, and then sit in a room with a bunch of theoretical physicists, and they'll talk about, well, so-and-so can calculate, but they really don't have any new ideas. So-and-so's got great ideas, but they never follow through. So-and-so can visualize really well, but they can't put it in an algebraic form. So-and-so's really good at calculational skills, but they can't visualize. Theoretical physics, they spend a lot of time making those sorts of distinctions. And if you said, okay, well, who's smarter, Julian Schwinger or Richard Feynman, they'd split up and they'd disagree because they had radically different ways of understanding what science should be, what kind of intelligence was at stake. So even if you go like the Powers of 10 film play, zooming down into the picnic table, down deep, you go down to the narrowest corner of fundamental theoretical physics, you have radical differences as to what counts as intelligence. And that's why I think that I think knowing that about the history of these sorts of arguments that go back, to the 1890s and Binet and what intelligence was for him and how it got transformed in World War I when they were trying to pick up the officer corps, and then, it was popularized, and what happened in World War II and the development in post-war and how it crossed with race and these decisions about gender and intelligence. Knowing something of that long history does give you pause when you think about looking for what combination of genes is going to explain intelligence. And now height is a good count, because height, if there's ever a one parameter thing, height's a good one parameter measure. You know, you're 6'2" or 5'3", and whatever, you know, that is your height. Now it's complicated enough to explain that, but when you have something that's polydimensional as intelligence is, it's different. So I think it's a very interesting cross between these long themes, and I think that some of the comments from the audience are spot on, that the issues of race and distinction, and I didn't know this long history of quality in its Chinese sense. A lot of times what's happened in race, in the history of race, in Western societies, is that the science lives on top of underlying tensions that have already been there. So you have discriminatory or prejudicial or colonial interests or national interests or linguistic distinctions, and then the science is invoked to solidify it, to give it a kind of extrinsic power that makes it sound as if it's not arbitrary, it's given by the science. And so I think that that's something that comes, you know, that history can use, just the way understanding more about the Chinese culture that surrounds this film. Both have that the history, the culture can help give us an added dimensionality of understanding. The last thing I wanted to say is that and I think Arthur mentioned this at one point, but you can look at science in labor historical terms, and the laboratory has a labor history. And one of the things that's marked the history of science in the last 20 years has been a realization that, you know, you have very different pictures of what a laboratory is, and what that metaphorical physicalized structure is a laboratory like a church? Is it like a bourgeois house? Is it like a factory in 19th century? Is it like a venture capital shop? You know, what is a laboratory like helps define the identity of what it means to be a scientist, and that has all sorts of consequences. And one of the things that goes on with BGI and other Chinese mass sequencing structures is they're starting to demand co-authorship for sequencing, and you know, so the Western companies and scientists that go to the fast sequencing shops in China say, oh well, you'll just do this work for us. We're the authors, and the Chinese are saying, no. We're going to sequence this for you, and we'll do it 10 times as fast as your local lab, but then you're going to include us, in addition to your fee, in authorial relationships. And that's very interesting, because what you're seeing is the contemporary labor history of science beginning to shape, or in Bourdieu terms, right, the financial capital and the symbolic capital are being crossed. They're no longer distinct. It's no longer a trade that takes place late in your career when you can trade being a fancy scientist for money. Now the money and the authorship, the symbolic and the real capitals are twined against one another. And I think that's another aspect that's in the background of what's happening in Chinese sequencing.
Thank you. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you, Evelynn. Thank you.